I confess that in America, I saw more than America. I saw there the image of democracy itself, its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, its passions, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress. So wrote Alexis de Tocqueville in the introduction of Democracy in America, which we will now turn to for the remainder of this class, next couple of weeks. This wonderful book that I have taught many times and read with a lot of enjoyment over the years on exactly that question of what democracy actually means for all of mankind, what self-government means, to be more specific. He says democracy. Remember, when we say that, what we really mean is just politics. And when the fact that people are able to do it themselves. So let's turn to the conclusion of this class on how to train your democracy, which we derive lessons from Alexis de Tocqueville's book. Who was this guy? He arrived in the United States in May of 1831 and went on tour. He came funded, this project was funded by the government of France, his homeland, to try to figure out the American justice system and the prison system in particular. Now, of course, as you can tell, he did a whole lot more than that. Democracy in America says some things about criminal justice, but it says a whole lot more about just the big, big picture of American life. He came and stayed for about a year and a half and would leave the end of 1832 to go back to France, but he would tour all over the place. Fluent in English, copious note taker. He traveled, of course, with his good friend, Gustave de Beaumont, who was kind of his personal secretary, who also took a lot of notes. And he interviewed hundreds of Americans of all walks of life, ordinary people, industrial types, farmers, poor people, immigrants, some of them French like himself, and just really, really soaked up every single aspect of American life. There had been plenty of travel notes before. This was a popular thing in the early 1800s. Many English travelers would come over and tour the United States and write down everything they saw and basically report back again and again. It's bad news. Americans are vulgar. Americans are crass. It's every bit the democracy you would expect. It's such an insult to aristocratic sophistication and taste. Don't go over there. It's awful. Tocqueville, though, had a whole different view. He's very critical, as you'll see, and he really dings Americans on all kinds of things. Slavery especially. There's no question about it. That is just wrong, and it's a huge blot on the American character. But all the things that Americans do to redeem themselves too. It's a complicated picture, but Tocqueville says, look, whether you like it or not, it's going to spread. It's going to be on your doorstep pretty soon. It's not just an American thing. As he said, it's a global phenomenon. While he was here, though, he met all kinds of interesting people, very famous Americans. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the greatest orator of his time. People would come to Washington, D.C. just to hear Daniel Webster give a speech in the Senate. And Tocqueville heard it, sat in the gallery and listened. Great fascination. He met former President John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. He met the wild, eccentric senator from Texas, Sam Houston, known for wearing his ponchos and his wide-brim hat in the Senate. Above all, though, the most famous American he met was President Andrew Jackson, and he was not impressed. Previous presidents had been either from Virginia, most of them from Virginia, or from Massachusetts, particularly John Quincy Adams and his dad, John Adams, were from New England. But Jackson, where was he from? Tennessee, the other side of the Appalachian Hills, and it showed. He was crass, he was vulgar. President Jackson embodied everything that seemed to be lowest and most base in American life. And all the while, Jackson justified his actions and everything he did as president in the name of the people, the people, the people. He truly was the first major populist president of his kind. So, what an experience. And what a story to tell when Tocqueville went back to France and wrote his book, which first came out in 1835, a couple of volumes actually, 1835 and 36. The first English translation made its way back first to England and then the United States in 1840. And Americans read it with great interest. And people remember Tocqueville. He was all over the place. invited to banquets and dances and formal events and everything, and this inquisitive Frenchman with his notebook who would ask you a million questions and write them all down, listen very carefully. What was he, though? Was he a historian? In some ways, yes, and historians have high regard for his work. He wrote several other books other than this one on the French Revolution, one about Ireland, one about North Africa. But this is by far his most famous. Is he a historian? No, sometimes he writes like a historian. Is he a travel journalist? Sort of, but again, he doesn't come to quite the same conclusions that other travel journalists do, that Americans are just awful people and disgusting and foul, he's positive and negative. It's not just travel notes. It's a lesson, not just about America, but like he said, for the world. Is he a sociologist? Maybe. He has this sort of in-depth analysis of human behavior and patterns of behavior and socially conditioned morals and things like that. Is he a prophet? Or you might say a futurist? He makes some astonishing predictions. Not all of them have come true. Some of them have been completely wrong. Others, as we'll see, have been absolutely true. Really, I think the truest thing of all about the book is just the way he describes the American way of thinking about ourselves. And it's exactly the same today as it was in the 1830s. There's nothing new under the sun in America. We've improved in some things. Obviously, slavery is abolished in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, things we mentioned earlier in this class. But all in all, we have very much the same aspirations and the same ways of thinking about ourselves and society as we've always had, Tocqueville shows. Was he a political philosopher? You could look at him that way. What was he overall, though? He was kind of all of these things. You'll hear glimmers of political philosophers we looked at. Sometimes he sounds like Hobbes, sometimes like Locke. He really sounds like Rousseau, and it's not surprising. Rousseau was French, and so was Tocqueville. Occasionally, he sounds like Aristotle. He's really hard to pin down because he kind of covers every base, and that's exactly what makes this an astonishingly good book. It's a great book. It is one to treasure and read and reread and think about and let it shape your view of things. It is the kind of book, as we said at the beginning, that makes up a liberal education. Liberal in the classic sense of you being liberated from the assumptions of your time, not just being a product, but being someone who is broad-minded, sensitive to the full array of ideas, and capable of self-government. And what is the goal of responsible citizenship, if not that? So let's begin, Alexis de Tocqueville. His opening line is quite something. The minute I arrived in America, 1831, he says, amongst the novel objects which attracted my attention during my stay there, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions among the people. I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society. It gives a peculiar direction to public opinion and a peculiar tenor to its laws. It imparts new maxims to the governing authorities and particular habits to the governed, to the people. The closer I looked, he said, I soon perceived that the influence of that fact extends far beyond the political character of the laws of the country. Democracy in America is not just a form of government or a regime. It's a whole way of life, of thinking about ourselves, about God, about everything. It may not always get it right, but still, it's the lens through which we look at the world. And that makes it well worth studying and understanding. Because pretty soon, as he said at the beginning, it's going to be everywhere, even in Europe. Democracy, he says, creates opinions and gives birth to new sentiments. It founds new customs, and it modifies old customs that it didn't produce. The more I advance in the study of American society, the more I perceived that this equality of condition is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to derive, and the central point at which my observations constantly terminated. So, what a claim. Equality of conditions. Of course, you know anything about American history, you say, what is he talking about? There were millions of blacks living in slavery, Native Americans being pushed off their land by that president, Andrew Jackson, remember? The Trail of Tears and the Cherokees. Women couldn't vote. They very often didn't even have basic rights under their state laws. Where's the equality here, Tocqueville? He says, well, consider the contrast historically. You might think America is very unequal, but have a look at the past. Consider our own hemisphere, he says, and consider the last 700 years in France. How did it go? Well, first of all, you have to remember who the three major classes were in medieval society. You had, as the medievals themselves would say, those who prayed, those who fought, those who worked, and everybody fit into one of those categories, unless you were like a criminal or something, right? Those who prayed, well, that was the church, the formal church officials, as well as all of the monastic orders. Those who fought, those were the knights and nobles who lived in the castles and defended their chivalry and their honorable code, descendants of family names. Those who worked, they were the peasants who usually worked for the nobles, sometimes for the clergy, but the vast majority of them for the nobles. Life was rigid and hierarchical, yet everybody knew their place. It wasn't a bad thing. But Tocqueville points out, even in this situation, in like the 13th century, there were cracks in the system. There was a slow, gradual process of realizing more and more equality. It was rigid and hierarchical, as we've said. He says into three parts. He would basically combine these two middle parts, right? But you had the monarchy at the top, the nobility in the middle. Those are, of course, lords and knights. Lords being old knights who settle down into their titles. And then you had at the bottom peasants, the common folk. But again, cracks started to show, and there's one major change that happened through the course of the Middle Ages. The fact that the clergy, they were the way, they opened the path for the common people to be declared equal in the eyes of God. True, you go to church in the Middle Ages and the nobles sit in the first few rows, sitting there in their fine clothing, and all the peasants and common people closer and closer to the back. But that was just convention. As far as the church was concerned, no way. The noble and the peasant are equal before God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory. Yes, you have certain social duties to know your place. Peasants got to work. Nobles have to fight. That's all fine. But in eternity, there will be no such hierarchy. Keep that in mind. And with that, anybody could become a monk. It was more likely that if you were from nobility, you'd become a bishop or an archbishop in the church, more likely a pope. But as far as the monastic orders, everyone was welcome. What else? Through the Middle Ages, increasingly, the court system would hear both sides in a criminal case, peasants and lords alike. Equality before the law, at least when it came to civil suits. When it came to criminal suits, too bad. If you're a peasant, you commit a capital crime, you're just going to face some horrific execution. But civil suits, yeah, lawsuits were treated as equally before the courts. So the church, the courts, and the rule of law. But then came the big one, commerce. Tocqueville says, page 23, whilst the kings ruined themselves by their great enterprises, like the Crusades and things like that, and the nobles exhausted their resources by private wars. What was going on among the lower order, those who didn't fight? They turned their energy to business. And you saw the growing economy through the course of the Middle Ages. The lower orders were enriching themselves, Tocqueville says. The influence of money began to be perceptible in state affairs. The transactions of business opened the new road to power. And the financier rose to a station of political influence in which he was at once flattered and despised. It seems kind of vulgar and low to, make lots of money. No, knights don't do that. They fight for honor. But then again, when the knight starts to notice that the castle is looking a little shabby, it needs some repairs, that he doesn't know for the life of him how to make his own armor, only a blacksmith does. Maybe those commercial businessmen know something that we don't. Indeed, it finally happened. You saw the fact that nobility was eventually for sale, right? That we had this rising noble class that had nothing to do with family names and castles and horses and chainmail. Instead, what you saw was lots and lots of cash and skill and marketable trades. Nobility, he said, was first conferred as a gift and through payment in the year 1270. And equality was thus introduced into the government by the aristocracy itself, the fact that rich folk could buy their way in. Along with this came the rise of townships, the medieval township, and you can still see these exactly as they looked, like like 600-700 years ago in certain cities across Europe, especially in England. What was this? It's a market square. It's a place of business and commerce. And the people who often lived in these places, what did they do? Engaged in trade and commerce, and really through that declared their independence from the feudal lords. The rule was that if you could run away to a town and hide out for a year and a day, and your knight couldn't find you, your lord couldn't find you, you were free. This was the first step toward local self-government, which would become so important in later ages. Another major source of democracy came from the highest nobility, the monarchy. Kings were always in tension with their nobles. Back to that pyramid we saw, the fights that would break out between the monarchy at the top and the lords just beneath him were very, very common. There were assassination attempts, kings always struggling with unruly nobles who didn't care about his crown and the fact that God had put him there. They cared about their honor and nothing else. Well, if you're a king in that situation, what do? You've got tremendous leverage against the nobles by looking to the people. Sometimes the kings would use the nobles against the people, but far more often, medieval kings would look to the people and try to elevate the masses over and against the nobility, which to the nobility seemed absolutely insane. What king is doing that? That's a demagogue. That's a tyrannical king, they thought. But nonetheless, kings did it many, many times. All of this amounted to what Tocqueville observed as this gradual movement toward more and more and more democracy. Even those who opposed it still ushered it along. It's an unstoppable force. It's like the hand of God guiding this tsunami of democracy forward, on and on. And so we see, even in modern times, there have been a few setbacks, as we know. Fascism following World War I, then the major dip followed by decolonization in Africa and Asia at the end of World War II, the fall of communism, but then it just spikes and democracies everywhere as it exists today, right? Not all democracies work well, they struggle, but all in all, it's a major aspiration around much of the world today, rather than autocracy. So, nobility decimated, he said, leveling of all classes, the realization among the people of their own independence. The noble has gone down, he says, and down the social ladder, middle page 25. The commoner has gone up. And as one descends, the other rises. Every half century brings them nearer to each other, and soon they will meet. And democracy will rule triumphant, and there will be nothing left of old aristocracy. Yeah, there will be rich. There might be new forms of aristocracy, but the old aristocracy of the Middle Ages, it's just going to die out, and you're never going to see it again. All served this, all made this happen. They served it unwittingly, he said. Those who have fought for it and those who have declared themselves its opponents have all been driven along the same track, and all have labored to one end, some ignorantly, some unwillingly, but all have been blind instruments in the hand of God. There's just a few holdouts, as we know, Russia, China, but the far greater number of people around the world, Venezuela, the far greater number of people around the world, though, they want democracy. They prefer it. If they have a chance, they'll get it. The gradual development of the principle of equality, he says, is therefore a providential fact. It has all chief characteristics of such a fact. It is universal, durable, constantly eludes human interference, and all events as well as all men contribute to its progress. So it's an irresistible revolution. It's like a tsunami of change, and yet it hasn't always gone well. Why? Well, consider yet another one of those kings who did a lot of favors for the people over the heads of the nobles, King Louis XIV of France. He gives you a 700-year, he's on that still 700-year tour of medieval history. But what did King Louis do in the 1600s, in the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Enlightenment? He invested a great deal in education for his people, the establishment of royal academies across France, encouraging more and more enlightenment and reason and mass literacy, in the belief that it was a king's job to reach down to where those backward, hopeless peasants were and lift them up out of ignorance. It was modern. You might even say it was a Hobbesian thing to do. Louis was very familiar with Louis was very familiar with Thomas Hobbes as a king, and he took his suggestions for how to run the Leviathan quite seriously. Educate the people. Hobbes is big on that idea. Not so much to educate them for revolution, no, of course not, but to educate them to see the value of the monarchy. So this cannot be stopped, this process, but again, it also needs to be regulated carefully. What will happen if we don't, as he says, renovate democracy, purify its morals, regulate its movements, substitute degrees of knowledge of business for its inexperience? Is it possible that people need to be conditioned to do democracy well? Well, Louis's grandson, King Louis XVI of France, had a whole different experience, as we know. He inherited the throne. He inherited the fabulous palace of Versailles that his grandfather had built. He married Marie Antoinette, known for her amazing hairdos, and they came to embody just sort of the excessiveness of the French monarchy. And it seemed to be the way it ought to be, right? The ostentation, the lavish parties, the crazy amounts of spending on fine food and drink and entertainment, not to mention Marie Antoinette's hair, right? All of these things added up to a very, very poor image. No longer was the French monarch out for elevating the people the way that King Louis XIV said. By the time of King Louis XVI, it was more like boastful domination of the people, in cahoots with the church. And with that, we saw the rise of the class consciousness of what was called the Third Estate. Remember the knight, the churchman, and the peasant standing next to each other in that earlier picture? Here you see the three of them again, but who's doing all the work? It's the French peasant. And he's becoming increasingly aware of his situation and more hateful of the monarchy. But he's also more literate than peasants had been before. And he's a lot more aware of revolutions in other parts of the world, like, say, the United States. He's a lot more keen on notions of his rights and his duties. And with that, the French peasantry becomes very class conscious and deeply resentful of their situation. The squalor and the poverty and the way that they're shut out from their own industry. They start to call themselves and see themselves as the Third Estate. Well, it so happened that there was a group of intellectuals in league with all of this, the Jacobins, as they were called, and the ringleader was Maximilien Robespierre. He was very much a civil servant for the government. He knew the king. He worked for the king and saw him daily. But by night, Robespierre was hanging out with radical revolutionaries, talking overthrow of the French regime and how would it work and what would it look like and how would it happen, plotting and scheming and thinking about all of this. And finally, it did happen. Bastille Day comes. The Bastille was a huge medieval fort that had been there for centuries. And it was also the armory for the monarchy and the king's army, as well as a torture chamber down in the dungeon below, where political prisoners would often disappear and never be heard from again. The people turned their fury against all of the king's ostentation and detachment from the people, plus their ideas of republican liberty, and they tore down the Bastille brick by brick and seized all the guns. There's nothing left of it today. King Louis made a run for it. He and Marie Antoinette tried to leave France and go back to her native Austria to gather up support, and they were caught at the border and returned to Paris, and they were put on trial as enemies of the people. And as we know, King Louis XVI went to that marvelous new contraption, the guillotine. No longer do you need an executioner with a big axe to execute enemies of the state. Now you've got this machine where you just put the prisoner on, drop the axe, and it makes a nice, clean, instant cut. And you can execute lots of people this way with great efficiency, with minimal suffering, but at the same time, the same electrifying effect on the crowd that executions always needed to have to prove as a deterrent against other enemies of the state. And with that, France descended into the terror. Not just the king, but Marie Antoinette and all the nobles and all the clergy went to their deaths on the guillotine. And as things advanced, pretty soon the revolution turned on its own members, including Robespierre himself. Finally, it came to an end, and all the chaos and trouble with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte turned all of the revolutionary energy outward, toward the world, toward Europe. And so Napoleon started storming across Europe, building for the first time a huge, powerful French empire. What happened here? We saw France go from this revolutionary fervor, just like we saw in America, the rights of man, right? They're real, they're true, fight for them, to Napoleon. Napoleon finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and was exiled to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, and France was taken over by the restored monarchy. But what really ran the show in France? Same thing today, the bureaucracy. Civil servants who filed papers, right? Centralized everything, and really ended up like a whole new aristocracy. It all went full circle. Democracy went from chaos to tyranny to bureaucracy, and it's kind of stayed there ever since. Why, Tocqueville asks, why did the French have such a horrible time with all of this when the Americans did not? When does democracy fail and when does it succeed? What makes it work? Well, we've considered a lot of answers to that question through the course of this class. We looked at Polybius back in the Roman Empire, or Roman Republic, I should say, claiming that it was about arrangement of the regime and offices for members of the Roman government. We considered the American founders and the way that they tried to design a republican form of government that would allow for democracy, but at the same time limit it through a system of checks and balances. James Madison's system of representation and the extended sphere. All of that's true. But Tocqueville says, well, look, I think there's a deeper reason here that we need to consider. Because like I said, this is a global phenomenon. Democracy is going to spread everywhere. Do you want it to look like it did in France or like it did in America? Take your pick. Tocqueville says, like the American outcome a whole lot better than my own France. Let's take some lessons for why it worked so well. Americans, it wasn't just their system of laws, he said. I'm going to go deeper than that. I'm going to consider the morals and the customs, the advantageous or prejudicial to mankind. Can't read. Page 34, he says. Towards the below the middle. He says, I have acknowledged this revolution as a fact already accomplished, or on the eve of its accomplishment, and I have selected the nation of America from amongst those which have undergone it, in which its development has been most peaceful and most complete. France's was not peaceful. It was a disaster, and it was not complete either. France, as you might recall, went through several later republics and remodeled their government over and over again before they finally settled down. So take America as a model, Tocqueville says. This is going to be the thing that shows us how to have a successful movement into global democracy, because it's coming, whether you like it or not. He mentions his sources. I pay attention to some written documents like a historian. I consider the opinions of ordinary Americans, and I interview them like a journalist. I study political customs like a sociologist. I consider the manners of the country. I consider the testimony of ordinary people as witnesses to their own democracy. He says, I took careful notes of every conversation I had. I will leave those, though, in my writing case. Right? Now, later, after Tocqueville died, a lot of his notes actually were published, and you can see all the interviews he had with people, and they're quite interesting. So, from the beginning, where is it? Jefferson, Madison, Washington, the American Revolution? No, he goes further back than that. He's not concerned with the political founding of America. He's concerned with kind of the cultural founding. Well, first you have to consider why this is so important. Most people study these things and they consider the development of a nation. You only study it when it's higher up. It has grown to what it is. Nope, he says, this is a great mistake. You must consider it in its origin. You must study the child in the cradle to truly understand the human being it grows up to be. That's a remarkable claim. Origins are everything, according to Tocqueville. I'm aware of the developments, he says. Yes, they matter, but that's half the story. What really matters is the true origins. So, what are the origins of America? Well, the earliest colonies, as we know, the immigrants who came over from England and other parts of Europe, they were mostly there to get rich. The tobacco plantations, in particular, they all came over and spoke relatively the same language. They understood the same general English principles of freedom. They had English habits. They had English religion. Of course, there were exceptions, the Quakers and Roman Catholics in places like Maryland, but in general, it was Christianity. And they had the same habits of the English. They had the deep habits of democracy, and those habits formed in this remote part of the world. But what about the South and the earlier colonies, like in Jamestown and the early settlers that came as early as 1607? Well, no, they were seekers of gold and adventurers. He said they often came over and they had no character. They were just out to get rich, like we said, off the tobacco, which was in high demand back in England, right? And there were all kinds of social movements against smoking even then, but still, it was kind of a taboo, and that made it popular, like we saw with prohibition in the 1920s, right? The more you forbid something, the more people want it. And so Virginia Colony and others were happy to provide. They came to get rich, though, and that was it. They didn't come for any other reason, and their characters tended to be pretty defective, and they tended to be kind of foul people. And worst of all, they brought over from West Africa slaves. This was the draw of the slave trade. If you're going to get rich quick and go retire in Europe, you might as well import other people to aid you along in that process. Not all Virginians agreed with this, of course, and there was huge pushback against it. But those who had the money to buy a whole bunch of slaves to work the tobacco plantations, they did it. What did slavery do to the South, according to Tocqueville? It made them slavish themselves, even the white Virginians, he said. It dishonors labor. It introduces idleness into society. You don't work the land with your own hands. Your slaves do it. As a result, what does it do to you? It makes you kind of lazy, kind of luxurious, not really the stuff of liberty and a free republic. It introduced idleness into society, he said, and it stuck. As tobacco transitioned to cotton, we saw this mentality spread all the way across the deep South. The darker regions were, of course, the big cotton producers. And it, like he said, it introduced this mentality among Southerners of the sort of aristocratic entitlement, this lack of concern with self-government. Granted, at the time of the founding, there were some extraordinary patriots who understood this well, Thomas Jefferson and many other Virginians, James Madison. But all in all, this is why they condemned slavery. In fact, we read the chapter on manners from Jefferson, where he said it's not so much the evils of slavery itself as it is the way that it undermines the possibility of self-government. The manners are corrupted by slavery. Totally different story, Tocqueville says, in the North. Here you had settlers who came for a whole different reason. And he turns his primary attention to the Puritans in New England. What were they like? Here, he said, page 40 at the bottom, 2 or 3 main ideas, which now constitute the basis of the social theory of the United States, were first combined. What was it? Well, he doesn't tell you till later, but the blending of religion and liberty. That's important because as revolutionary ideas take hold in Europe, especially by the time of the French Revolution, almost 200 years later, liberty is incompatible with religion. It was thought, not for the Puritans. And their teaching and their experiment in self-government was a beacon lit upon a hill, to paraphrase John Winthrop's famous sermon you might have heard before, A City Upon a Hill, which, after it has diffused its warmth immediately around it, also tinges the distant horizon with its glow. Great description. The Puritan legacy, he believes, never goes away. It's always, always with us. What is that legacy? Well, he lists a bunch of its elements. There was a strong sense of equality among the Puritans. Certainly not by our standards, as we know. Women had a very subordinate position. And indeed, they had slaves too, very much like the South, not as many, but still, it's a lot more equal than it was back in England. Education was a huge deal for them. The need to educate kids, we'll get to that. But above all, the family. the fact that Puritan families came to stay. They're not here to get rich and go back to England. They're here for good. First arriving in 1620 on the Mayflower, and then more and more arrivals showed up. And it was accepted early on that they were not going to go back to England ever. Remember, these are the very same people who had lost, right, in the end of the English Civil War. They won, of course, under Oliver Cromwell, and then later lost during the Glorious Revolution, or sorry, during the Restoration. King Charles II came back. Well, instead of trying to reform England, they figured, let's not try to fix the Anglican Church. Let's just go be ourselves. That was the idea. They were austere. They were strict. Everything you'd expect of Puritans. But Tocqueville points out, they did all this to bring about the triumph of an idea. And what was that idea? That self-government was possible. They were saturated early on with democratic ideas, the Puritans were. And they made a compact, a very important precursor to the kinds of charters and laws and even the Constitution that would come later. He quotes it, "In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James at the time, have undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia," like the way northern parts of Virginia. This is Massachusetts. They didn't know that. "Do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic." It is a social contract. Backed up, though, by the idea of a covenant, a contract you make with your fellow citizens. You saw that in Hobbes, you saw that in Locke and in Rousseau. A covenant, though, you make with each other, but before God. It's a very Old Testament kind of idea. That was in 1620. With Charles I gone, fresh crowds of Puritans came. Sorry, I meant to say Charles II restored. Get history mixed up. Fresh crowds of Puritans came, and more and more and more came over. And the British government didn't care. What are you doing over there? Doesn't matter. Go govern yourselves. Just stay loyal to the crown and pay your taxes, and that's all we really cared about. The king granted them an official charter, and they were approved to not only be off on their own, but to govern themselves as a political society under the protection of the mother country, of course, but still allowed to elect their own officials, to pass their own laws. And what laws they passed? Like every single thing that appeared scarcely a sin, this rigid understanding of morality, laws that went down to every aspect of social life, right down to the length of hair, foul language, public drunkenness, and the penalties were harsh. The gospeler, who was basically a gossiper, had to stand in the town square with a sign around his neck. And of course, the iconic image of the Puritans was the pillory, where people would look at you in the stocks and throw rotten fruit at your face. The shame, the humiliation. Of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous novelist, picked up on this. You might have read The Scarlet Letter, a woman who has the letter A embroidered into her shirt for having gotten pregnant out of wedlock. Great novel, go read it. But yeah, the floggings, the brutal methods that were meant to just shame and humiliate. Why do they do all of this? Well, again, it wasn't just to be cruel to themselves. It wouldn't be cruel to other people. They imposed these laws on themselves. The elected officials who passed them in city councils and state assemblies were elected by the very people who accepted those laws as normal. And they were very meticulous about due process of rights of criminals in every single case. Even the Salem witch trials, which Tocqueville doesn't go into, but we forget that a great deal of the evidence that came up in this case was thrown out. A lot of people were acquitted of witchcraft after being accused. So it wasn't quite the sort of hysterical situation that it's often portrayed as. It had a touch of that in Puritan society, but as far as the law courts were concerned, no, due process meant due process. But what about the devil? He's everywhere, right? These terrifying images of the devil taking your children, having you sign your name in his book in exchange for magical powers and all that kind of thing. What to do about the devil? How do you keep him out? where there were the usual Christian answers, obviously invoke the name of Jesus Christ first and foremost, but along with that came a very keen sense for education. And he quotes the famous sermon on education. I forget who it's by, where they say that old deluder, the devil, right, wants to deprive you of enlightenment. So let's make sure our children are constantly taught to be literate, aware of their history, or we're able to read the Bible, of course, but able to read everything. Literacy in the book was a huge deal for the Puritans. Here it is. It being, says the law, page 46, it being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of Scripture by persuading them from the use of tongues, or to end that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers, in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting in our endeavors. And parents would face heavy penalties for not ensuring education for their children, and sometimes their children would be taken away by the community to be educated. It was that critically important. There you see the origins of American compulsory education and the emphasis on literacy and competence, all certainly for spiritual reasons for the Puritans, but over time for political reasons too. So keep that in mind when you think about public education. It has deep old Puritan roots, and this really set the tone for future education in the United States. Tocqueville will have more to say about that, as you can imagine. Meanwhile, back in Europe, absolute monarchy, the writings of Thomas Hobbes, the feudal order of the Middle Ages, concepts of rights were very vague for most people. In New England, it was crystal clear. What a whole different world this was. Clearly, the New World and the Old World are on very different trajectories. So, what's the Puritan legacy? Was it the fact that faith and reason were fundamentally incompatible, and that the only truly free people were ones free in their minds and enlightened and free from superstition? That was kind of the sentiment in this era. You've seen, you might have seen Darby's famous paintings, the Englishman who really kind of challenged Enlightenment assumptions. Could science instill the same awe and reverence in us that religion once did? Do we really know what we're doing with the Enlightenment? Consider the day when the cathedral at Notre Dame was desecrated in the French Revolution, and an altar to the goddess of reason was set up, and the belief that clearly religion and liberty are incompatible. Not so for the Puritans, and not so for the Americans later. They offered that very valuable lesson that religion and liberty, or religion and republicanism, you could say, fit together in an important way. That the more enlightened you became, the more religious you became. So too, the more religious you became, the more enlightened you became, and both worked together to form self-government for years and years to come. So those are the Puritan roots, but what is the outcome for American society? In chapter 2, he turns to this fascinating discussion of what he calls the democratic social condition. Other translations call it the social state. What are the long-term impressions that Puritanism makes on us? If that's our birth, the origin of a thing is more fundamental than its development, right? If that's what the American founders had to work with, few generations later when they had the revolution and framed the Constitution, well, what is it exactly? And here he gets less of a historian and more of a sociologist, though he still ties in some history. And he points to one thing in particular that guarantees democratic equality, but it has economic roots. And he points out not many other people who study America or democracy have noticed this quite like I have. Well, consider, he's always going back and forth between the old medieval order in Europe and America. Consider what it meant to have an inheritance, to give an inheritance in the old world, especially for the aristocracy. Every time it was the father who passed the estate to the oldest son. And that also meant the land and everything that belonged to the father, and he got it from his father, and he got it from his father, to back time immemorial. So what does this mean for the way that land is distributed? What does this mean for families? I have a lot to say about families later. But Tocqueville points out that the Americans very wisely avoided this. This kind of thing was not going to happen in the United States. What is it? Inheritance laws. And these were already in place even before the American Revolution, and then they took off afterwards. He says on page 50 in the middle, these laws of inheritance, these were the last step to equality. So the Puritans started it, these laws of inheritance finished it. I'm surprised that ancient and modern jurists have not attributed to this law a greater influence on human affairs. It's true that these laws belong to civil affairs, but they ought nevertheless to be placed at the head of all political institutions. They have, he says a few lines down, moreover, a sure and uniform manner of operation upon society, affecting, as it were, generations yet unborn. The old aristocracy passed land from father to oldest son, father to oldest son. Where did the younger brothers go? Many of them would become monks. Some would become merchants. Some would just bum around the castle. But still, it was always about the oldest son, oldest son, oldest son. As a result, as he says, because Americans got rid of this, aristocracy could not spring out of the ground. Right? It formed on opposite principles. Its action still more rapid. It divides, distributes, and disperses both property and power. What is he talking about? Well, in America, these property laws required that every estate, when the old patriarch died, had to divide it up between his kids. Not so in the old world. That was all about the oldest son. That goes back to the Bible, right? Jacob and Esau. But in America, state laws stepped in and required, colonial laws and then later state laws stepped in and required that patriarchs divide up their property. As a result, you don't have huge swaths of land and property and wealth sitting in the same family across generations and generations and generations. There still is the phenomenon of old wealth, of course, but it's not what it was like in the old world. What does this do to the families themselves? He'll have more to say about this later. They are not bound together by the estate anymore. They are bound together by affection, love for each other. And he'll have a lot more to say about that later, but here you can see where it comes from. So yeah, aristocracy, oldest son, to father's oldest son, father's oldest son. But in democracy, in virtue of the law, he says, page 51, of partible inheritance, the death of every proprietor brings about a kind of revolution in the property. It has to be divided up. The more kids you have, the more evenly you have to divide it. Now, did this include women? Not always, but some states did, and they required that women at least inherit at least 1% of the inheritance. What that means is that wealth, estates, become smaller and smaller at each division. It only takes a few generations to break this all the way down. This is the direct, and as it were, the physical effect on the law. It follows then that in countries where equality of inheritance is established by law, property, and especially landed property, they must constantly tend to division into smaller and smaller parts. This equal law of division exercises its influence not merely upon the property, but it affects the mind of the heirs, of those who inherit the wealth, and it brings their passions into play. It changes the way they look at the world. So what happens? Well, back to the aristocracy. The family there represents the estate, he says, also on page 51. And the estate, the family, whose name, together with its origin, its glory, its power, and its virtues, is thus perpetuated in an imperishable memorial of the past and the sure pledge of the future. It will always be the land and the wealth in the family, they thought. But in America, when the equal partition of property is established by law, the intimate connection is destroyed between family feeling and preservation of the estate. The property ceases to represent the family, for as it must inevitably be divided after one or two generations, it is evidently a constant tendency to diminish, and it must in the end be completely dispersed. So there's still great wealth to be made in America under these laws, but where does it come from? Not inheritance. It must come from work and ingenuity. So what does that mean? The old patriarch dies, he's got 10 kids, big families back then. Well, that means he has to divide up his estate 10 different ways. Well, what will the kids do with that money? One will wisely invest, right, in the stock market, in a private business, or he'll open a trade or pursue a trade or something like that. What does the other one do? As Tocqueville says, he will try to gratify the passions of the moment. He buys a Ferrari, and he sets out on his own. And what happens? One recklessly spends his wealth, the other wisely invests it. What does that do across time? You see wealth changing hands. The sense of the family breaks down, at least as an aristocratic unit. And like we said, it reemerges as a natural bond between people who love each other. In the United States, he says, bottom 52, it has nearly completed its work of destruction of old aristocracy. You're never going to see aristocracy again in America. We don't have any castles here, right? Except Disneyland, but that's fake. There's a lot of romance about aristocracy and knights and lords and dukes and all that, but we'll never see anything quite like that here. The English laws, he said, concerning the transmission of property were abolished in almost all the states at the time of the Revolution. The law of entail, these inheritance laws, was so modified as not materially to interrupt the free circulation of property. The first generation having passed away, estates began to be parceled out, and the change became more and more rapid with the progress of time. And now, after the lapse of a little more than 60 years, he says, Republic still new, only 60 years, the aspect of society is totally altered. The families of the great landed proprietors are almost all commingling with the general mass. What does family name mean anymore? Yeah, it's certainly a sense of belonging, but still, you don't invoke that name to command respect from people. What happens is money displaces honor. That might sound bad. You really want greed to be greater than honor. But Tocqueville says, look, consider what that honor meant in the old world. It meant shutting out the common people. If you make it about money, that's different because that's something everybody can pursue. Consider the maps. There's France about Tocqueville's time. Huge swaths of land were all fiefdoms and the property of dukes and lords. And if you're an independent farmer, you're pretty much shut out. Your only option is going to be to work for the feudal lord. And if he has enough serfs working his land already, he has no use for you. So you're just going to starve. Contrast that with our property laws in the United States. There are a whole bunch of private estates in some rural area, some bigger than others, but still, each of those has to be divided up every time the owner passes away. And it has to be divided up equally among his children. So does this mean that there's no aristocracy and sort of peasant class in America? Well, there still is, but what's the difference? Much as the aristocracy likes to think that it's honorable and sophisticated, right out of a Jane Austen novel, right? It's not the same as it was back in the Middle Ages. This aristocracy is built not on honor, but on wealth. And wealth changes hands. It circulates. So too, who are the poor in America? They're usually people who are down and out just for a time. But what do? They get industrious and they find their way out of poverty. Everybody's changing places now. No longer is it that rigid hierarchy of lords on the top and serfs on the bottom. Now, these people are switching places all the time. Fortunes are lost, fortunes are gained. That's a good thing in the aggregate, because that way it compels Americans to learn a trade, to find a way to keep themselves and their families out of poverty, instead of just falling back on dad's money. Again, there's still old money in America, and these inheritance laws are long gone in our time. They disappeared by the end of the 19th century, but they did a lot of good, Tocqueville believes, in making sure that money changes hands, changes hands, changes hands. That tendency to displace, though, he also points out, has everything to do with westward expansion. So again, one son wisely invests in the stock market, the other invests in a blacksmith shop or something like that, teaches himself working with metal and makes his own independent fortune. The other son gets a covered wagon, right, and goes west. This was a large part of why the Anglo-Americans migrated in the early days. By the middle of the 19th century, it was not just Anglo-Americans, it was people from Europe, so it was different then. But again, it caused this sense of displacement, this feeling that we don't belong to the land in the same way. So let's go try our luck elsewhere. Let's go west, go west. It has an effect too on the mind of Americans in an interesting way. They're not too keen on books. They prefer newspapers, right? Or you might say today, Wikipedia articles or the quick, easy summary. Give me the shortcut that tells me everything I need to know in the fewest possible words. So it was with the newspapers in the 19th century, and he'll have more to say about newspapers later. What happens to our intellect? We have just enough to be literate. Literacy rates were very high by the time Tocqueville came to America, but not so literate that we are erudite, not so literate that we read lots and lots of classic texts and books. We have high literacy, but low intellectual ability. Or ability, you could say interest. And this is something he'll come back to and have some interesting things to say about later. But yeah, he points out they have the first elements of knowledge, but that's about it. Reading lots of beautiful classic texts. Some do, but people like that are rare. The greater emphasis on the intellect in America is just good enough to do democracy, to participate as a citizen. Beyond that, well, there's all those old books, but what do they really matter? But maybe it'd be good for us to read those books. Maybe this is the wisdom that might check democracy. Well, that becomes to be the role of American colleges and universities. So here we are. We'll get to that later. But still, it's that sort of disruption of the class order that he mentions that causes this sort of middling element, neither totally illiterate peasants at the bottom, nor sophisticated erudite college grads at the top. We're just all kind of in the middle. And that's good enough for us. In America, he says, most of the rich men were formerly poor. Most of the poor now enjoy the leisures absorbed in the business during their youth. The consequence of which is that when they might have had a taste for study, they have no time for it. And when the time is at their disposal, they have no longer the inclination. They're not interested. So there's ability, but then there's just interest, right? There is no class then in America in which the taste for intellectual pleasures is transmitted with hereditary fortune and leisure, like in the old world, and by which the labors of the intellect are held in honor. Everything, he says, is held to a middling standard. Mediocrity is the rule. Right? We'll come back to that idea. That's very important. But what about the power of the people, the will of the people, the sovereignty of the people? It's written right in the Constitution, remember? We the people, we are the sovereign. We have officials who hold office, but they're part of the people too, and they only do it for a time, and voters decide whether or not they stay in. He says in chapter 3, whenever the political laws of the United States are to be discussed, it is with the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people that we must begin. Not the sovereignty even of the law, even the law itself points back to the people. Not the sovereignty of a class of aristocracy that's long gone, right? Well, because of those inheritance laws and several other factors. It's all about the people, the people, the people. The principle of the sovereignty of the people, he says, which is always to be found, page 57, more or less at the bottom of almost all human institutions, generally remains there concealed. It always was about the people, even in the Middle Ages, even those peasants. It really was about them. They just didn't know it. All that's really happened with the rise of democracy in America and in the world is they do know it. The will of the nation is one of those phrases, he says, which is often used by despots and tyrants. I am the will of the people. You hear that clear into the 20th century. Adolf Hitler always talked that way. Some have seen the expression of it in the purchase of suffrages, voting of a few of the satellites of power. Others in the votes of a timid and interested minority. And some have even discovered it in the silence of the people, on the supposition that the fact of submission establishes the right of command. But in America, all that has changed. The principle here of the sovereignty of the people is not barren, nor is it concealed. And it is with as it is with some other nations, there's nobody, telling the people what they want or what they ought to want. They say what they want, and they say it loud and clear. Every election, federal, state, local, every opinion piece in an article. Of course, by the 20th century, you start to get opinion polls, actual data. We've looked at some of those before. So yeah, there's a very clear, solid voice of the people. There's dissenting minorities, of course, right? But the majority, you know it when you hear it. It is recognized by the customs and proclaimed by the laws. It spreads freely and arrives without impediment. and its most remote consequences, he says, again on page 57. So yeah, it's everywhere. The people are the self-conscious sovereign. In some ways, you see it operate, he says, like a body of citizens in Athens, the Greeks, the polis. In other ways, you see it expressed through representatives chosen by universal suffrage. About this time, remember, all free white males were allowed to vote. That still leaves a lot of people out, as we know, but still, it was a step in a whole new direction. Those representatives are chosen by universal suffrage, and they transact business in the people's name and under its immediate supervision. Right? Nobody says, here's how America ought to be governed because I know best. No, everybody says, no, this is what is good for the people. This is what the people want. They may not be right, but still, they put it that way. So in America, he says, this amazing line at the end, page 59, the people reign. The people reign in America, in the American political world, like the deity reigns over the universe. So the voice of the people is like the voice of God in American politics. They are the cause and the aim of all things, and everything comes from them, and everything is absorbed into them. Wow. That's a bold statement on his part. Well, where did this come from? We've seen traces of this in what we looked at already. There was kind of a dispute, you might remember, not direct, they didn't talk about each other, but James Madison, on one hand, was all for democracy just so long as it was channeled through Republican institutions of representation, Federalist 10, right, in the extended sphere. But really, if Tocqueville's right, he sounds a whole lot more like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, doesn't he? The whole notion of sovereignty of the people is probably the one major contribution that Rousseau made to American political thought. And he kind of one-upped Madison in this way. So we still have our institutions, we still have representation and checks and balances and all these things that try to limit the power of democracy, not because democracy is bad, just because it needs to be, limited. Well, what has actually happened? If Tocqueville's right, Rousseau's idea has triumphed. The people are the people are the people. They tolerate representation, right? But if it was up to them, they would do it themselves through majority rule every time. What about, though, the way that they do this at the local level? He zeroes in on the fact that Americans have far more local interests. Federalist 45, right? The power of state and municipal governments, much more so than the national government. This is, by the way, the Capitol Dome, as Tocqueville would have seen it when he visited in the 1830s. Now we have that big white dome of marble. Back then, it was made of steel, and so it had sort of a lower dome. But still, that was fitting because Congress was a humble institution then. It only dealt with national concerns, and there weren't that many. Far more common were state and local. Where did the action happen in American politics? Not here, not in the national system, but in the state and local system, particularly the township. That is an inheritance of the Puritans. So along with the church, along with education, there was, of course, the Puritan town hall meeting. And that is a deeply influential idea that the Puritans left behind. And it's practiced widely, according to Tocqueville, even today. Americans don't tend to look to the center. They don't concern themselves with what Congress, what the federal government is going to do for me. They just do it themselves. This has a lot to do with what he calls decentralization. Centralized power is where the federal government runs the whole show. And that's, how it is for most countries around the world, even today, even in France, where he's from. Not in America, though. Because of federalism and because of the spirit of local government, there's just no such centralized power. He says right at the beginning, it's a great line on page 64, nothing is more striking to a European traveler in the United States than the absence of what we term government or administration. And it was true. The likelihood of you ever meeting a federal employee or a federal agent was like nil. You just never would meet one. The only exception was, of course, the postal worker, right? The post office was always a big deal, but that was it. You'd have to go to Washington, D.C. and request a meeting to actually meet a federal employee. There were customs clerks. There were people who regulated interstate commerce and the borders between states. There were people who ran lighthouses and things like that, regulators, but they were few. Far more often, if you met any kind of official, government official, it was a local official. More likely, it was someone that you and your neighbors voted for. Might even be your next door neighbor. Government close to the people. That's the idea behind federalism. That's what Tocqueville marvels at, because it's not like that in Europe. He says written laws exist in America and one sees the daily execution of them, but although everything moves regularly, the mover can nowhere be discovered. That's an amazing description. The hand that directs the social machine, he says, is invisible. What makes it all work? Nobody really knows in America. Somehow it just does. Well, Tocqueville, as you'll see later in the book, finds what he believes his answer, and we'll get to it. But on the surface, it's baffling. Like, how does a society even hold together when Washington, D.C. is so remote and the capital is just off there, regulating commerce and building up the military and just doing big national things? Meanwhile, down here in small town America, there's no contact at all with that. And yet somehow we all govern ourselves. Nevertheless, he says, as all persons must have recourse to certain grammatical forms in writing, which are the foundation of human language, in order to express their thoughts, so too all communities are obliged to secure their existence by submitting to a certain amount of authority, without which they fall into anarchy. The authority may be distributed in several ways, but it must always exist somewhere. What is he saying here? The authority that Americans learn to submit to, just like every society, there's nothing anarchic here, right? There's law and order. But the authority they submit to, they find in themselves. So really, each of us is our own king. And that means that whatever laws we pass are passed by people very close to us, or maybe we pass them ourselves as members of the town hall meeting. We govern ourselves in a decentralized way. There's no need for a king. There's no need for a powerful Congress. Maybe at the national level, sure, there's a Leviathan who needs to defend the country from foreign attacks and things like that, but those are very minimal tasks. Far, far more governing happens right in front of you. We are decentralized. How is it in France? He compares, he always goes back and forth between the old world and the new world, between America and France. What is it like in France? Every problem, every social or economic concern is solved in Paris. Every time there's some, a broken window or a dilapidated church building or whatever, do the citizens band together and solve it themselves through their local politics and local government? Do they take up fundraising? Do they use interest groups to try to solve the problem? No. They write a petition, send it to the appropriate ministry in Paris, and they wait. The petition sits on the desk of a bureaucrat, and it goes to another bureaucrat and another bureaucrat. And maybe 15 years from now, some government contractor will come down and fix the broken window. It never works that way in America. What do you do about the broken window? Group of citizens gets together and fixes it themselves. What do you do about the dilapidated old church? The community bands together and does a Save the Church fundraiser, raises a bunch of voluntary donations, and fixes the church. You can think of endless examples. Or consider tax policy. There were, believe it or not, no federal taxes, really up until the year 1913, at least until the Civil War anyway, on income. There was an income tax during the Civil War, but it was swiftly struck down by the Supreme Court. Later, we had an amendment to the Constitution formalizing income tax in the federal government and the IRS. But prior to that time, all the federal government collected taxes only from interstate commerce, as well as tariffs on exports and imports. And that was it. It was an extremely low budget operation. Most other taxes were collected, of course, by local governments. And when your taxes were collected by the tax official, you saw exactly where the taxes went: to the roads and bridges, public works, cleaning up the town or whatever. You saw a very direct outcome, and you knew the guy who collected your taxes. Again, decentralized instead of centralized. What are the effects, he says? There are practically no regulations on American life, other than interstate commerce, goods that pass between states. That's all, though, right? You can tell how much this changes in the future, but at the time, yeah, no regulations. It's the kind of thing you would expect to be like anarchy, but it's not. So consider what we see when the bureaucracy is formed in France. Everything needs to be regulated. Everything needs to be uniform. There are planners and administrators, very often with advanced degrees from the academies and universities. And they are very, very good at organization and regulation and taking rules and applying them to society. They make the rounds, right? Telling merchants and ship owners and storefront keepers and rope makers and everybody the rules that come from the government that you must obey. Not so in America. There are no such regulations. It seems like anarchy sometimes, and indeed it's messy, and yet somehow it works. Americans figure it out. You can't help but notice that the roads are well taken care of. You can't help but notice that necessities are met, things work out okay. So we have, though, as we know, the danger of centralization. How long can we maintain this decentralization? Well, he says, only so long as we maintain our trust in ourselves. Americans maintain their trust in themselves. Page 71, he says a little below the top, useful undertakings which cannot succeed without perpetual attention and rigorous exactitude are frequently abandoned. For in America, as well as in other countries, the people proceed in sudden impulses and momentary exertions. Let's do it ourselves. Let's fix it. Let's start a business. Let's clean up the town. Let's do this. Let's not look to the bureaucrats in some office somewhere, right? The European, though, he is accustomed to find a functionary always at hand, right? Again, a bureaucrat, always at hand to interfere with all he undertakes and reconcile himself with difficulty to the complex mechanism of administration of the townships. All the towns are under the control and the administrative control of Paris. Everything's about the center there. Not here, not in America. It's far less regular. Sorry, in America, the power which conducts administration is far less regular, far less enlightened, and less skillful, but 100-fold greater than in Europe. So it is messy. It's mysterious how it actually works. But the bottom line is it does work. Americans figure it out all on their own. And as a result, this is very good for politics. So all in all, what has he described here? This resolves a very interesting tension. And we touched on this before, and I noticed some of you caught this in your papers, that the Hobbes-Aristotle dichotomy between the city, the polis on one hand, and the national Leviathan state on the other, is not entirely irreconcilable. Turns out Americans have both. We have a national government deeply concerned with national security, as Hobbes taught. But within that state, what do we find? A whole bunch of polities. The polis is everywhere, and the political life is alive and well. Are we fundamentally motivated by fear? Maybe on a national scale, but are we that way locally? No, the city lives on with decentralization. So yeah, it's not the administrative, but the political effects of decentralization that I admire most, he says, at the bottom of page 73. This is good for politics. It makes the city live on. And he was aware of the tension between these two. And he was aware of how Thomas Hobbes convinced everyone that the state was all there could ever be. And yet here, Americans have gone a whole different direction. But there's a danger. Sorry, I skipped ahead a minute ago. What's the danger? What if we lose our nerve? What if we lose our confidence in our ability to band together at the local level and figure it out ourselves? Inevitably, we will start to look up at the national system, at paperwork and bureaucrats and experts. And Tocqueville has to admit, there's a certain elegance in the European bureaucracy. They plan society and it looks organized and it looks like there's a sort of reason to it instead of all this spontaneity. But Americans, as messy as it is, it still works for them. But they might lose it. There might be centralization. And there's a number one reason for that. He says it very specifically. Individualism threatens to lead to centralization. Well, what does that mean? Well, the more individualistic we are, the less we band together into groups and basically form a polis, like Aristotle taught. And like he said, anyone who has no need of a city is either a beast or a god, right? We become so individualistic that we are unable to band together and fix our problems ourselves, well, inevitably, who's going to step in and fix them? The government, the state, the bureaucracy. So if we get the rise of bureaucracy, it's not going to be the bureaucracy's fault. It's going to be our fault that we kind of submitted to it, he predicts in the future. This is absolutely what philosophers like Max Weber were concerned about, if you read it in another class. Definitely what we see with Franz Kafka and The Trial. You've ever seen the film adaptation of that novel? The fact that guys at desks, regulators, can wield more power than elected politicians is a very, very troubling thing. This is where we're headed. If Americans lose their ability to govern themselves locally, to value politics at the local level, well, has it happened? Pretty much, yeah. There are a variety of other factors, but it seems as if that sort of surrender of local political power and the dislike for politics and the preference for expertise in administration has contributed greatly to the rapid growth of government, more so at the state and local level than the federal level. But still, those are a lot more federal bureaucrats than there were in Tocqueville's time. Don't try to govern yourself. Call the experts, becomes the mentality. Do we really want that? As we mentioned before, as much as you may not like politics, notice politics is freedom. It's liberty, right? No politics is tyranny. We're probably not going to see tyrants ever again. Tocqueville entertains that idea. What sort of tyranny can we expect? But whatever we get, you can expect bureaucrats. You can expect unelected officials who work for the government who have the power to regulate your life, and they are totally unaccountable. Did Tocqueville call it? Maybe we should recover the value of political life at the local level again and do it ourselves. When we come back, we'll turn to the next section, chapter 6 to the end. And he does spend some time talking a great deal about the political aspects of democracy. He considers also what kind of tyranny we might expect. He said quite a bit about this, right? The bureaucracy, like we said before, as Americans become too individualistic, they lose their trust in each other and they turn to the government. Well, what would that actually look like? He speculates in a variety of ways about what a democratic version of tyranny might actually be. So yeah, have a look at those things, and I will see you next time.